Hello, welcome back to Math Time with Professor Prime, and I'm your host as always, Professor Prime. What makes a good sequel? It's a tricky question, and I feel like there's so many answers that you could suggest, right? Because this is like, is it upping the scale and scope? Is it upping the stakes? Is it maintaining consistency? Is it doing something different without deteriorating in quality? And does it matter which medium we're talking about here, right? These are all, I think, valid questions. And I want to talk about all of these things as well as some of my favorite things slash series, and kind of go from there. Okay, so I want to talk about Nier Automata. I want to talk about Dragon Ball Z, Devil May Cry, Metal Gear, Horizon, and Star Wars, right? And so I think it's only fair to say spoilers for everything I just mentioned, like spoilers for Star Wars, everything Star Wars, spoilers for everything Metal Gear slash Metal Gear Solid, spoilers for everything Dragon Ball, spoilers for everything Devil May Cry, spoilers for everything Horizon, and spoilers for everything that's like Nier slash Dragon Guard. Just all the spoilers for all the things. Let's proceed. So, again, what makes a good sequel? Well, let's start off with Star Wars because Star Wars is an interesting example, right? Because I feel like there are good sequels and then less good sequels. if, okay, but if we start with that first Star Wars, aka Episode 4, aka A New Hope, if we start with that original Star Wars, it is a phenomenal like movie, and it's nothing short of exceptional. And so it's like, how on earth do you construct a sequel to that? How do you make it better? Well, I'd like to point out, like, at least behind the scenes, it was like all hands on deck sort of situation, right? Some top talent were involved, right? And I think that was a start, right? But like, if we're talking about the movie itself, like what's happening in the movie, um, well, you still have the rebellion versus, the Empire, right? And so you have the big battle with the Death Star. So it's like, hey, in that first one, it's like, well, what happens after that, right? There's still a threat. And so enter Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back. Empire is my favorite movie of all time. It is like fantastic on its own, but it's also a wonderful sequel. Because it does a lot of things. Like, right, on a personal level, it ups the stakes. It brings in just so many revelations. Luke has been upped in terms of his prominence, but you have the idea of like Vader rising in his, or us, because he's been doing things like off screen, but like you have him being more and more of a threat and more of a larger presence. Like you're seeing crazy stuff through him, like with him throughout the film, and you have this idea that it's like everything is way more personal, and like Luke is like very important to the rebellion, but you have the idea of like, hey, the Empire, they want to corrupt him. And so he has to contend with that in his own feelings without really knowing that. Like he's dealing with his own darkness, and it's just kind of funny how things are lining up. But the whole thing is that it's like, well, hey, how do you get like a bigger threat to the universe than that Death Star, right? Like, what do you do there? And it's like, well, the Death Star is part of a larger issue, right? And so you still have that idea of the Empire and getting to know them more. So you're upping the stakes in terms of like making it more personal and making it clear that it's a struggle for the rebellion. And their main hope, may not be enough. And so you get that idea, right? Um, and you just see like more of this back and forth, and I like that. You see more of the universe. You see things fleshed out about the Force. So it's like I feel like the scale and scope they did expand, but they expanded in some specific ways because it wasn't like, hey, let's get 2 or 3 or 4 Death Stars or anything like that. It was like, hey, let's make things more personal. Let's find out more about these characters. Let's find out more about this universe. Let's find out more about the Force. And what I like about it is that it ends kind of on a downer there. Like the heroes don't really win per se. It goes poorly. And like Luke versus Vader is like even before the big revelation that Vader is Luke's father, like that fight does not go well for Luke, like at all. And it's just like, I feel like a, there's so many things that can go into a good sequel. And what I'm okay, um, saying that a movie is good, right? Like if it's good to you, right? Like that is a subjective thing, right? Like it's hard to say that a movie is objectively good, let alone a good sequel, right? Like and I think with Empire though, it's a fascinating thing because I think with opinions now, like people largely get it, but there was some pushback back in the day. Um but for me, I think what makes it special is like the people making it, in that like they expanded the universe. They kept a consistent like high quality, and they upped some things, and I thought that was really cool. And I also like how like the lightsaber fights expanded, because like okay, I think the one in the original Star Wars, like between Obi-Wan and Vader, is like it's actually good. Like if you go back and watch that, it's not bad. Now some people will say that it's bad. They don't know what they're talking about. It's not what they're used to sometimes, or like they might think that, oh well, it's not as flashy as it could be. But here's the thing: they missed the point of the fight. Like one, it was good. It wasn't great in comparison to some other fights, but the big point was like it was a good fight. But the big thing is like it's like a conversation that's a fight. Or you know what I mean? Like, because the whole thing is like, hey, basically Vader and Obi-Wan, they're having this fight, both with words and their actions. They're having this larger conversation. If they both wanted to go out, they could have. And I don't really think that's a thing that the characters are debating in the film. It wasn't really like that. But I will say, it feels very differently in Empire, because the lightsaber fight in there is just really good. Vader versus Luke. There's so much build up to it, and I enjoyed the choreography in it. Like, and it also like it served a different purpose though. So I think that was a fascinating thing too, because like at this point, we have all the things that have been established in that first Star Wars, and then it's like, hey, what can we do to be true to that while expanding? And I think they nailed it. So it wasn't just like an issue of like expanding the scale and scope, because you can do that. It's like, well, what does that mean? But it's like you have to have like the characters developed, or if they're not outright developing, just be interesting, if nothing else, at a minimum. And so I think like with Empire, it nails it. It nails it completely. But like Star Wars though, is a huge franchise with many sequels and many related materials. And I want to talk about that in a whole nother video. But like my whole thing is like, I think The Empire Strikes Back is an excellent like example of a good sequel, because it took what worked about the original and it expanded upon that in various ways. And it was just everything was well developed. If you look to the following sequel, because like I don't even want to go down a rabbit hole of the prequels and then the sequel trilogy, because again that's another discussion for another video. But I will talk about Return of the Jedi real quick. Return of the Jedi is like, mm, it's tricky, because it's like, oh, it's a sequel to Empire, but the end of that initial trilogy. So it's got two things that it has to be, three if you count it being its own thing, and it's kind of a mess. People talk about like later Star Wars material, and rightfully so. There's a lot of good and a lot of bad, but with Return of the Jedi, um, it's a good movie, but not a great one, and it's not a good sequel, not to me, at least not in terms of quality. But in terms of concluding the story, fair enough, right? So it's like I'm of two minds with it. On one hand, if we're talking about just this story, it's a decent conclusion to things, if not predictable. And it also has a really kick-ass lightsaber fight. So it's like there is that. I like that, and it was just like that was done really well. So it's like it's not bad story wise. right? Like, if you're looking at the big picture, and again, it had to be its own thing. It had to be a sequel to Empire, and it had to be the conclusion of that initial trilogy. And so it had to do a lot. But where I think it fails, and where I think it's not a good sequel, is the presentation. So it's an interesting thing to me because it's like, hey, you got to look at both the story and the presentation when dealing with the movie. And in terms of presentation, it's kind of a mess. Again, it has that amazing lightsaber fight between Luke and Vader at the end of things, right? I think that's really cool. But let's talk about like a good third of the film, right? Like, God, that beginning chase, or well, not just the chase, but it's like that beginning opening sequence where they're rescuing Han. That goes on for like 40 minutes. And if you think I'm exaggerating on that, go back and watch it. It's nearly 40 minutes, which is about a third of that runtime. Like, like what is not very well paced. And there are parts where it doesn't go how you think it would go. But like, I don't want to bash on Return of the Jedi because I do think it's a good movie. It just pales in comparison to Empire, and I think like, hey, it kind of is what it is. You had that first Star Wars, which was amazing, and then you had Empire, which was somehow even better to me, and Return of the Jedi. It's good, but it's not as good as those two. Um, so it's just like it's a fascinating thing because I do feel like it works as a conclusion to the story. It works as a sequel story wise. Like it's not bad. It's reasonably competent, but I think the presentation can be a mess at points, and same can be said for the dialogue. So for the presentation, it's like not as much. It's not as tightly knit as those first two movies. But again, my goal with this was not to bash things, because again, like that movie is not a bad movie. But I wanted to bring it up because you just like I had what I thought of a is a good example of a good sequel with Empire and a less good sequel with Return of the Jedi. And then if we get into the prequels and the sequels, which is it's a rabbit hole, like because there's a lot of good and there's a lot of bad. Um, I don't feel like they ever quite get to those same levels as those first two Star Wars movies, but they can stand on their own. And it's like the question is, oh, hey, what is a good sequel, and does something have to be a good sequel? And that's a whole nother issue. But if we move to different franchises, though, because I can go down a Star Wars rabbit hole, and I can stay there for a while, or I can keep on going down. Um, so let's talk about Near Automata. Oh, and no, let's wait on that. Let's talk about Dragon Ball, and we'll kind of talk about the main story with Dragon Ball, and then use that to start talking about video games, and then kind of go from there. All right. So with Dragon Ball Z, right? I want to talk about that. Like, and just to be clear, I'm aware that the initial manga is just Dragon Ball, but with the Z section of the series, most people are going to know that as Dragon Ball Z, and I'm also going to be more focused on the shows because there's other sequels to Dragon Ball in that show world, so that's what I'm going to go with. Um, let's move forward. Okay, when it comes to Dragon Ball, like well again, like you have that whole idea of like in the manga it's just Dragon Ball, right? But like you have those like distinct parts of the story. I mean, time skips have been a thing in Dragon Ball before that huge one that leads into Dragon Ball Z territory, but you know, it ends up being interesting. So if you look at the shows that focus on those earlier Dragon Ball days, um, it's good. The show isn't perfect, but it's good. It's got a lot of action and it's got a lot of cool stuff for the characters, a lot of like adventure. And so then what about Dragon Ball Z? What about that Z section of the story? Um, well, what makes that good? I'd argue like all of Dragon Ball is good, but there is a turning point with Dragon Ball Z, or AKA the Z section of the story. There's that idea that there is a switch more from fantasy to sci-fi, even though sci-fi has always been firmly in the mix. So there's more focus on that, right? Like, all of a sudden it's just like Goku isn't just this monkey boy; he's an alien, and same for Piccolo. When you go from just these adventures on Earth to outer space for a while, and for the character development. and the way the action evolves, and how the animation improves, I think like you can make an argument that the story is good. Well, partially because like the source material, right? But also in what that source material does and how it's presented, because when you look back at that source material, right, you have the idea like, hey, these characters are growing, like Goku is still Goku even though he's grown in development, and everything and everyone is changing along with him and around him, and you're introducing like some like characters who become mainstays, like at this point, and like when you get to Dragon Ball Z, you know, like Piccolo joins the good guys. Gohan enters the picture. Um, and then like you have the idea of like Goku, you know, being an alien, being a Saiyan, and like Piccolo being a Namekian, and both of these things end up shaping uh, the rest of the series. So you have this idea that you reach this like new show, or if you're reading along with the manga, you're entering a new realm in the story. You know, however you cut it. There's the idea that the lore has expanded. Um, Things have happened to the characters that change them in ways that were worrisome now, but they were new at the time. And I think that's really cool. So you have the source material already being great in terms of like the action expanding, and the characters and lore expanding. But then you also have like the presentation, like the animation got smoother, got better in certain ways, and it just like became iconic. And the way these characters are developing their fighting styles and the things that they're able to do, that evolves too throughout the story, right? Because like if you go back to earlier Dragon Ball, like most of the characters weren't flying, right? Like that was something that you see more when you know Tien and Chaozu like enter the picture, right? And then like later on, and though characters could shoot ki blasts, it wasn't with the regularity that we saw later on. And like you go from this like really cool like on the ground fighting, very tactical, to like these crazy aerial battles that are, you know, people are moving at these insane speeds that are like hard to comprehend, shooting ki blasts everywhere, just beating the crap out of each other, both like on land but also in the air. Like I said, that aerial part is like crazy, right? Because it's like how, right? So then you know, and then on top of that, you have more transformations as the series goes on, and like some people don't like those, but I think they can be interesting. I just like the idea of transformations and like change in general, but like in a story, they could also represent something important. Like some big ones that stand out is like Goku going Super Saiyan or Gohan going Super Saiyan 2, like things like that. They also carry narrative weight in addition to like, you know, upping the ante, you know, so to speak. So I think like that's pretty cool. And if we're sticking in the realm of the shows, Z has like a legacy. Um, Dragon Ball GT is a thing, and I would say that like GT isn't the worst. I think if I say it's bad sometimes, it's mostly because it's mediocre. It's really okay, but it's a letdown coming off of Z. Like the stakes are pretty high, but like they never feel that way, right? Like with the Black Star Dragon Balls, it doesn't feel great. Dragon Ball GT is a show that like it had some interesting ideas. Like if you read about it, like I read about it back in the day, like before I ever saw it, then you would think like, hey, there's some interesting ideas, and then when you see them, you realize they're not executed well. And so like I think like Dragon Ball Z, like whether we're talking about the show or we're talking about the Z section of the story, it ends up being a good sequel, both because of what's happening with the characters in the story, but also what's happening with the fights, what's happening with the presentation of everything. Then you jump ahead to GT. It is a weird thing because it's like the premise of GT, it starts with Goku getting turned into a kid again, and so it's like that's stupid, and I will always maintain that it does not go well. But past GT though is not the only legacy to have come out of, you know, Dragon Ball Z, right? Because then you have Dragon Ball Z like Super. Oh, sorry, Dragon Ball Super. Oh my God, you have Dragon Ball Super, which I like, and not everybody does. I think it's a mix of just things. There are times where like it does not feel like a good sequel, because like one is integral. It takes place in between, you know, the end of the Buu saga and the end of like Z. Like, so before that last tournament, and before like you see Oob and all that. So it's like somewhere in that like 10 year time skip, right? Like that's how it gets played out. And so there's an issue, with how someone that comes across and how it's presented. But I think like there's several times where it does feel like a good sequel, and I feel like if they had better focus and if it took place after that, that would work in its favor. So I have mixed feelings about that, and it's like it calls into question what's really good. It gets like parts of it are good, is a sequel, and parts of it are not. And overall, I did enjoy Super. And then you have Daima, which is recent. It also falls into that same idea of being an interquel, um, between like the end of the Blue Saga and the end of Z, and it I don't think it really works that well is a sequel, like because it very much feels like its own thing, right? Um, but it's like the animation is so slick with it. The story doesn't really go where you think it should, and they make that same mistake that GT made, only on a larger scale because this time it's not just Goku getting turned into a kid; it's everyone. So that's wild. But my whole thing is like, what makes a good sequel? Like some of it's the story and the character and development, and some of it is the presentation and how things feel. But it's really a subjective thing. And then for Metal Gear, that's a fascinating thing because one of the big things with Metal Gear, if you're looking at the presentation, I think like pretty much every Metal Gear is a good sequel in terms of the gameplay, in terms of how it builds on itself. Because like it grows. Like there's a formula established with that first Metal Gear, right? And neglecting the NES version of Metal Gear and its sequel Snake's Revenge and going to Metal Gear 2, you see that formula refined, right? And then you jump to Metal Gear Solid. Metal Gear Solid's an interesting thing because, right, it feels like the start of a series, but it's really the third main canon entry into Metal Gear. So it itself is a sequel, and I'd argue a good one because it's a wild thing, right? It's like it's this sequel that feels like a reboot that also feels like a remake of the previous games at the same time. It's doing the most while also being a really great standalone game. Like Metal Gear Solid is one of my favorite games of all time. So and it's also like in a unique sort of area, right? Because it's like I said, it's doing a lot, right? It works really well as a standalone title, but it's also a sequel to Metal Gear 2 and, just Metal Gear as well in that same line, right? But it also feels like a reboot and a remake of those games in some other ways. But not only that, it was the series jumping from 2D to 3D. So for me, it makes a good sequel because, well, the presentation and the way they handle that jump from 2D to 3D, but also that idea of the voice work, the music, expanding the scale and scope while staying true to that Metal Gear formula and spirit. And then, you know, it has had sequels. Like with Metal Gear Solid 2, it does that same thing, like I said, with the gameplay. So as far as the gameplay is concerned, it's a good sequel. As far as the story is concerned, debatable. Like it's not a bad story, but it's just like Metal Gear Solid is so tight. It's a very tight, very well constructed experience. And then you have something like Metal Gear Solid 3 coming along, and it's just a bonkers thing, right? Because it works in some ways as a sequel to everything despite being a prequel, and yet at the same time it works really well. It is a prequel, and as a standalone game, and it is a game that like innovated a lot of things to an already well established formula. It's great. In Metal Gear Solid 4, it does things differently than Metal Gear Solid 3, but it still represents that evolution. And Metal Gear Solid 5 too, but like in a different way. I don't think it made a good sequel story wise, but it definitely did some really cool things gameplay wise. And then with Devil May Cry, that's been an interesting thing because it's like, what makes a good sequel for Devil May Cry? And it's like part of it is the gameplay, and of course part of it is the characterization, the story, and all that stuff. Like, Devil May Cry 3 is an interesting case because it's a prequel to the entire series, and a sequel to Devil May Cry 2. Um, is doing a lot, and it's also its own thing. But what I think is really cool is it works really well, not only as a story, not only in terms of like the characters, but it works so well in expanding the scale and scope of the music as well as the gameplay in some really bonkers way. Like Devil May Cry, it has amazing combat, and yes, Devil May Cry 2 did add some things to that, but Devil May Cry 3 came along and it's just like bonkers. It expanded everything. And then Devil May Cry 4 did add some things. It's a good sequel, but not a great sequel. Um, and I think like most of its letdown is in the story. It added some quality of life stuff like switching on the fly, and so that was cool. And then like you see that in like later ports of Devil May Cry 3 and also in later games like Devil May Cry 5. Um, with Devil May Cry 5, it's just like it's a bonkers thing because it's the final entry in that main series. It is a sequel to 4, but it feels like a sequel to 3 just because of the spirit and energy of it. But it combines like everything that's great about Devil May Cry. So it's like it's really cool. And then just to kind of like circle back to Star Wars and Dragon Ball, like they all have games, and with Star Wars, like the one thing that stands out to me, I mean, there's been many Star Wars games, but like some like KOTOR, like it's fascinating. It is so well formulated, and so then it's like, what about KOTOR 2? And just to be clear, like Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic is what I'm talking about in this sequel. The sequel was developed by a different studio. I argue that there are things in the narrative that don't work just because of like the character that you're playing as. I don't like their origin story for that character, but it is a great game. It does expand on what worked about KOTOR, and again, it was just developed by the same studio, and it's I'm sorry, different studio, and it worked. And then with Dragon Ball games, it's just like you get one type of Dragon Ball game, and then you get a million sequels with those, and some of those sequels are just expanding on different gameplay elements of that. So they're kind of just like better in design for that. Um, but they're interesting nonetheless because like by the time you enter that line, end of the line, you get something that's like really refined. Like even if you enjoyed previous games, now as we've gone on in time, there's been like less Dragon Ball games, like they've been more spaced out. But my whole thing is like, what makes a good sequel? It depends. Like it's very subjective, and you could have parts of it be a good sequel, and then parts of it not. Like for something like a movie, for instance, it's like it could be a good sequel in terms of story. It could be a good sequel in terms of characterization. It could be a good sequel in terms of presentation. And if you're lucky enough, it can be all those things and more. And with gaming, it's that same sort of idea, but you have that gameplay element of it. And so that's what's fascinating to me. And I guess my big thing is like, um, either like there's no set answer for what makes a good sequel, but I think evolution and consistency, like they definitely are in it, at least to me. But again, it's a subjective thing. But in any case, I hope you enjoyed that video or this video and the ideas. Expanded upon it. If you have an idea of what like makes a good sequel, please feel free to share.